Hi, I'm Magda from Interiors Exteriors. In this episode, we'll discuss common mistakes people make when decorating apartments. But first, I'd like to emphasize that sometimes the same situation can be a mistake or not. When we don't think something through and later regret that things turned out the way they did, then we can call it a mistake. However, when someone consciously decides on a certain solution, it doesn't necessarily have to be a mistake. That's why there aren't any clear indications of what is a mistake and what isn't. It's better to talk about aspects worth paying attention to, but if I wrote that on the thumbnail, the text would be too small. That's why I allow myself to use such a generalization and a slogan that we all simply know well: mistake. Not paying attention to dimensions. Very often I come across the fact that thinking about interiors, about what we want to fit in there and how to arrange it, happens completely without considering the dimensions of the given room. And after all, it's hard to talk about a kitchen design without really knowing what will actually fit in there. Doing this by eye is really very short-sighted. I know that sometimes it seems like it's just an estimate, that everything will somehow fit, that we can feel the space, but honestly the measurements are very important and we shouldn't ignore them. Not paying attention to the measurements and the possibilities of a given room leads to a lot of unnecessary problems. Sometimes it comes down to centimeters. When we buy a slightly bigger sofa, suddenly the bookshelf that was supposed to stand next to it doesn't fit anymore, so we have to put the bookshelf somewhere else. And to put it somewhere else, we have to move the dresser that used to stand there, and suddenly it turns out the whole room has to be arranged differently. Why create problems when you can just measure everything first? I know that for many people, math brings back bad memories from school, but it's really worth overcoming that reluctance, grabbing a measuring tape, and it's best to also have a laser distance meter at home, because with a laser meter, you can measure large distances more easily by yourself. After all, when you extend the measuring tape, it gets wobbly, and usually at some point you need two people to make it work properly. And once we have the measurements written down, we can really work on it reliably. Mixing styles. Too many inspirations at once. Sometimes it's hard for us to decide what we like the most. And those interiors are nice in those ones, and actually those ones too. And as a result, we take something from each style for ourselves, which of course in some form is totally fine. Okay, but sometimes this leads to some very strange combinations that won't necessarily look as good as the inspirations we drew from. When we take a photo of a glamour interior and it looks great with all those sparkly things, moldings and velvets, and then we take a photo of a raw Scandinavian interior with wooden paneling, like a seaside cottage, that one also looks great. But when we combine those sparkly things with that raw wood, that velvet with the paneling, it doesn't necessarily still look good. Some things are hard to combine, and when we don't have experience, we should be especially careful about that. It's not just about interior styles, but also colors. When we like a palette of pastel colors, they all go nicely together. We admire interiors where a lot of pastel shades are used, and then we mix colors in a similar way in our own spaces. After all, they looked good in the inspirations, but we also like a color that isn't pastel, and suddenly we introduce it into the interior. Now we have a vibrant yellow, here we have burgundy, here we have navy blue, and suddenly it turns out that it's no longer a pastel palette. Combining so many colors from different palettes won't necessarily be as harmonious. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't mix colors, that we shouldn't mix styles, or that we have to be very strict when choosing what we like. Definitely not. It's just that if you're already basing things on some inspirations, pay attention to whether mixing them will actually give a good result. You can even cut out elements from those photos you downloaded from Pinterest and put them together to see if mixing any elements from those inspirations still gives you a cool inspiration, or if they're actually completely different stories and you need to be very careful about how you want to combine them. Disproportionate decorations. And Unfortunately, here it's more often about them being too small rather than too big, and you can especially see this with picture frames. In the store, when we look at frames, those in A4 size or smaller look really nice when we hold them in our hands and the picture looks good. An A4 frame even seems quite big, but then we hang that 20 by 30 frame on the wall, 350 x 260, and it just looks a bit poor. It's disproportionate to the surface it's on. And if we make a gallery, then of course that's fine, but if we hang two such frames on such a large wall, it won't necessarily look harmonious. Paradoxically, because it might seem that small is safe, in interiors it's actually more often safer to choose formats like 50x70. They're already quite large, but not so much that they wouldn't fit even on a relatively small wall. And 50x70 on some walls might also look like a small picture, but much more often it will look just fine. And it's similar with other decorations. Often in stores or on vacation we buy some tiny figurines or little vases. Very often they end up looking too small in the interior. It's unfortunate, I know, and I feel the same way, but honestly, arranging such small decorations in an interior is just difficult. There's no need to overwhelm yourself right away with various items that are just decorative. It's better to choose 2 or 3 that really fill the space, and those little ones will gather over time. And I definitely don't mean to discourage you from buying small items at all, because that's not the point. I have a lot of them myself. They have sentimental value to me, and I don't intend to get rid of them. However, this means that some people see my interior as cluttered, and I just accept that. I take it in stride. Buying pretty furniture without any idea how to use it. This is a controversial point, because on one hand it's wonderful to hunt down a beautiful piece of furniture that will end up in our future apartment, where we can display it nicely, and it will give the interior a unique character. However, if you have more of these pieces, it may turn out that you have a problem with storage, because these decorative pieces of furniture aren't necessarily the best way to store things. Built-in furniture from floor to ceiling helps make good use of space. Most pieces of furniture that look decorative and that we eagerly buy at various flea markets or stores definitely do not meet these requirements. It's the same in my living room, where I have 2 display cabinets and a large sideboard that's very low, so even though it's deep and its cabinets are really very spacious, there are still only 2 cabinets and 3 small drawers. And the sideboard is about 1.8 meters long, so it takes up a really large part of the wall. And if you put 2 wardrobes there or built a custom shelving unit, you could definitely fit more things and have better access to them. That's why we should first think about how many things we have and how we want to store them, and only then add the more decorative furniture. Because what's the point of having a very stylish interior if it's going to disappear under piles of things we have nowhere to put away? A sofa on legs is beautiful, for example. I love that light form. But what's the point if we have to stuff half the wardrobe in the bedroom with a guest duvet because the sofa doesn't have a storage compartment? That's why it's good to find a balance and somehow combine those functional, practical pieces of furniture that help us solve storage issues with the more decorative ones that create the style of our interior. Improper storage. This point is somewhat related to the previous one, because even if we buy a display cabinet and all the things we want to store fit inside, storing documents or chargers in it may not necessarily be the best aesthetic choice for our interior. And of course, the interior doesn't have to be aesthetic, because it's meant for living, but it's still worth asking yourself whether you'll be able to relax well while looking at tangled cables and documents that might remind you of work or a case that's dragging on in court and strongly affecting your stress levels in life. What's the point of having a lot of shelves and being able to arrange everything on them if the shelves are open and there are just some things we don't want to look at? We need to properly adjust the way we store things to the items we are storing. And what's more, it also needs to be well organized. It's nice to have a lot of drawers, but if each one is a jumble of mixed up things and finding anything in there is almost impossible, then you can't really talk about comfort or making the best use of that space. It's definitely better to have organizers so that everything has its own place, and when you open a drawer, you can immediately reach for what you need. That's why it's so important to organize storage based on the things we own, so that our everyday life is simply more pleasant. Lack of precise space planning before renovation. And this is a very big point that I'll discuss in more detail in a separate video, but at the same time, it's also very common. We start the renovation, the crew comes in, and we still don't know where everything will go, because we think that once the walls are ready and everything is done, then we'll just arrange the furniture somehow. But that somehow isn't necessarily the best, and sometimes it's not even good. When we're having outlets installed just anywhere, it's very easy to end up with a situation where one outlet is blocked by the bed, another by the wardrobe, and we won't have access to them. Why install outlets that we won't be able to use properly anyway? That's why it's definitely worth it, before we schedule the crew and before the renovation date comes, to think about what we want to have and where, very specifically, really specifically. It can save us some costs during the renovation and will definitely help us enjoy the space later once we have everything arranged the way we want. Let me know in the comments what else is worth paying attention to, and maybe also what you've run into yourselves. It's worth it so that others can also learn from our mistakes. Take care, subscribe to wnetrzazewnetrza, and see you next time. Bye bye. Thank you.